Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the rostrum Dr. Gino Strada.
Good evening, honorable members of the Swedish Parliament and Swedish government, members of the RLA Foundation, fellow laureates, excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to receive this prestigious award that I consider a sign of appreciation for the outstanding work that the organization Emergency has done in the past 21 years in favor of the victims of war and poverty. I'm a surgeon, and I've seen the wounded and the dead ones in several countries in Africa, in Asia, Middle East, in Latin America, in Europe. And I personally did surgery on several thousands of patients, injured by bullets, by shrapnel, by bombs from rockets. In Quetta, the Pakistani city close to the Afghan borders, I met for the first time the victims of anti-personnel mines. I did surgery on many children injured by the so-called toy mines. Small plastic green butterflies the size of a pack of cigarettes. Scattered in the fields, these weapons wait for a curious child to pick them up and play with them until the detonation occurs. One or both hands are blown away, burns over the chest, the face, the eyes. Armless and blind children, I still have vivid memories of those victims, and the view of those atrocities changed my life. It took me a lot of time to accept the fact and the idea that war strategy could include practices like deliberately maiming children in the enemy's country, weapons designed not to kill, but to inflict horrific sufferings to innocent children and posing a terrible burden for the families and the society. Even today, those children are for me the living symbol of contemporary wars, a persistent form of terrorism towards the civilian populations. A few years later in Kabul, I went through the files of about 1,200 patients and to discover that less than 10% of them were likely to be combatants. 90% of the victims were civilians, 1/3 of them children. So the question arises, is this the enemy? Who pays the price of war? In the past century, the percentage of civilian victims of war has rose constantly from 15% in World War I to more than 65% in World War II. And in the 160 or more conflicts that the planet has experienced after Second World War, 90% of the victims have been civilians, basically all over the world, very much like the data from Kabul. Working in war-torn regions for more than 25 years, I have witnessed this cruel and sad reality, perceived the magnitude of this social tragedy, of this carnage of civilians, mostly occurring in areas where health facilities are virtually non-existent. Over the years, Emergency has built surgical hospitals for war victims in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Sierra Leone, in many other countries, and then expanded medical activities to include pediatrics and maternity, rehabilitation center, clinics, and first aid posts. I would say that the idea, the origin, the foundation of Emergency back in 1994 did not derive from a set of principles and declarations. It was rather conceived and born in operating rooms, in the surgical wards, because treating the wounded is neither generous nor merciful. It's simply just. It has to be done. In 21 years of activity, Emergency provided medical and surgical care to more than 6.5 million people. A drop in the ocean, you might say, but that drop made a difference for many. And somehow it has changed the lives of all those who have been sharing this experience, like me. Every time in the different conflicts we have been working in, regardless who was fighting against whom and for which reason, the result was always the same. War was nothing else than killing civilians, death, and destruction. The tragedy of the victims is the only truth of war. So, confronted daily with this dreadful truth, we embrace the idea of a community where human relationships are founded on solidarity and mutual respect. And this hope was actually shared worldwide in the aftermath of the Second World War. This hope led to the establishment of the United Nations, as stated in the preamble of the UN Charter, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations, large and small. The indissoluble link between human rights and peace and the relation of mutual exclusion between war and human rights were also stressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed back in 1948. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And the recognition of this equal and inalienable rights is the foundation of peace, freedom, and justice in the world. You know, this declaration today sounds provocative, sounds offensive, sounds false. Not one among the signatory states has completely implemented, 70 years later, the universal rights they had committed to. The right to a dignified life, to a job and a home, to education and health care. In one word, the right to social justice. At the beginning of the new millennium, there are no rights for all, but privileges for few. And the single and most aberrant, widespread, and persistent violation of human rights is the practice of war. In all its forms, deleting the right to stay alive, war denies all human rights. I would like to stress once again that in most countries ravaged by violence, those who pay the price are women and children. 90% of the victims are civilians. We shall never forget that. We are living a very tragic period of our history. In the month of November 2015 alone, more than 4,000 civilians have been killed. In several countries, including Afghanistan, Egypt, France, Iraq, Libya, Mali, Nigeria, Syria, and Somalia, and the list can go on and on. Many more people have been wounded or maimed or forced to flee from their homes. Being witness of the atrocities of war, I have seen how turning to violence has most of the times only brought in more violence and sufferings. War is an act of terrorism, and terrorism is an act of war. There's no difference. They share a common denominator, the use of violence. 60 years later, we are still confronted with the dilemma that posed in 1955 by leading world scientists in the so-called Russell-Einstein Manifesto. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? Can we have a world without war to guarantee a future for the human race? The question is still there 60 years later. Many would argue that wars always existed. This is true. But it does not prove in any way that the recourse to war is inevitable, nor can we assume that a world without war is not achievable. The fact that war has marked our past does not mean that it has to be part of our future as well. Like diseases, war shall be considered a problem to solve, not a destiny to embrace or appreciate. As a doctor, I could compare war with cancer. Cancer vexes humanity and claims many victims. Does this mean that all the efforts of medicine are useless? On the contrary, I think it is exactly the persistence of this lethal disease that prompts us to increase all efforts to prevent it and to cure it. Conceiving a world without war is the most stimulating task the human race is facing. It is also the most urgent. Atomic scientists, through their doomsday clock, are warning human beings. The clock ticks now just 3 minutes to midnight, because international leaders are failing to perform their most important duty, ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization. The biggest challenge for the next decades is to imagine, design, and implement the conditions that will allow reducing the recourse to force and to mass violence until their full disappearance. War, just like deadly diseases, has to be prevented and cured. Violence is not the right medicine. It does not cure the disease, it kills the patient. The abolition of war is the first indispensable step in this direction. We might call it utopia, as this never occurred before. However, the term utopia does not designate something absurd, but rather a possibility that still has to be explored and accomplished. Many years ago, even the abolition of slavery seemed utopian. In the 18th century, the possession of slaves was deemed as normal, a mass movement gathering hundreds of millions of citizens over the years, decades and centuries, changed the perception of slavery. Today, we repel the idea of human beings chained and reduced into slavery. That utopia became true. A world without war is another utopia that we cannot wait any longer to see materialized. We must convince millions of people that abolishing war is urgently needed and achievable. This must penetrate deeply in our consciousness until the idea of war becomes a taboo, expelled from the human culture and from the human history. Receiving the Right Livelihood Award encourages me personally and Emergency as a whole to multiply our efforts, caring for the victims and promoting a cultural movement for the abolition of war. I take this opportunity to appeal to all of you, to the community of the RLA laureates, to join forces to support this initiative, working together for a world without war is the best we can do for the generations to come. Thanks very much for your attention.